Good morning, everyone. I just realized that I was muted. So much for that. At any rate, I should say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, as we are here coming from all over the world. And it's a pleasure and a privilege to have each one of you. So I will start with my attempt of welcoming everyone in different languages. Welcome, bienvenue, benvenido, caribou. Some of these languages, you're going to have to teach me some words, some of you, to let me know or to say welcome in your languages. But the intent and the feeling are here. As in, this is a table that we want to keep making larger, as we want everybody around the table. Welcome, everyone. This is one of our courageous conversations. We are excited about it. I'm going to pass the baton to Emily. Emily, where are you?
I'm great.
Just for reflection.
All right, well, welcome everyone. I see many new faces, so welcome, and we're grateful that you are spending this hour, maybe a little longer than an hour, with us. My name is Emily Nielsen-Jones. I am one of the co-founders of this project, and our aim is to create safe and brave spaces like this to really wrestle with a lot of the contradictions that we navigate at the nexus of faith and tradition and the long walk to freedom that we are all on, to shed and heal from all of the oppressive systems, excuse me, that maim our collective spirit as a human family. And obviously the name of our project, the Girl Child and Her Long Walk to Freedom, we're walking in the shoes of the girl child because she enters into a world that is filled with traditions and norms that do not honor her agency and her spirit as a human being. On a personal note, this project is born out of a good dose of exasperation, watching the needle fall backwards for women and girls around the world, but also an even greater dose of humility and grace and love and faith and hope as we journey together, walking this next mile with the girl child. So my job is to open the video. I probably already said more than I should say, but we are so grateful to have DAI and Michele and Jane with us. And we created a video together that embodies the girl child and her long walk to freedom within an evangelical tradition. But before we watch it, I invite you to close your eyes and enter into a womb-like space within you. During Advent, the interplay of darkness and light are a theme that Christians around the world navigate, and many others as well. So I invite you to sit in the darkness of your own heart. And darkness, it can mean the unknown. It can also mean your own struggles, whatever that means to you. Just rest for a few moments and breathe the breath of life. As you inhale, feel the gentle kindness of the breath of life. As you exhale, release everything that is occupying your mind and your heart. And just sink into that still space within you, which is where the divine lives. In this dark, nurturing space, we all are seeking something for our journey journey as leaders, as human beings. I invite you to just sit with whatever you're seeking right now. It's a vulnerable place to be, but a beautiful place. And now I invite you to walk in the shoes of the girl child that we will be watching. We'll explain a little bit more about the video afterwards, but enter into the video in a prayerful silent space within you.
Rebecca was a respected doctor, community leader, and long-term member of the local evangelical church. It was natural for her to lead and take charge at the hospital or in volunteering in the community. But of course, that was not appropriate at church, since she was a woman. Lately, this began to trouble her more and more. She volunteered at the church, but none of it was terribly fulfilling for her. Sometimes she wondered,
did God make a mistake when giving me these gifts?
She wanted to do all that she could for Jesus, but it seemed that the church was the one place she was able to give the least. At her weekly prayer meeting, Rebecca decided to introduce the subject of women in leadership.
Do you believe that all women are to be in submission to all men?
Submission to my husband? Yes. But submission to all other men? I don't think so.
Well, I believe the Bible draws a picture of mutual submission between husband and wife.
The Bible is perfectly clear. Women should submit to their husbands and should not teach or be in authority over men.
But what about Abigail and David? She deceived her husband and saved her household.
Well, that was just Old Testament. Paul clearly says that women are to be silent in the church. Maybe we need a thorough Bible study on this subject to know what the word really does say overall.
Rebecca began to read everything she could on the issue of women in leadership.
If the Bible truly says that women are to be in submission, not hold positions of authority and remain silent in the church, then I want to obey my Lord completely. But if the Christian faith truly sees women as valuable, loved, and equal to serve in every role, then I really want to know.
She was ready to learn, ready to change, and ready to take the risk to obey God, wherever it led. Tonight had been the monthly leadership meeting at Rebecca's church. Her leadership was highly regarded. In fact, the elders had come to respect her ability to think through issues. She had been looking forward to sharing a new vision, a ministry to the poor and needy living just outside the church. But the topic of church governance came up, and a new missionary called for a proper structure that would help the church grow. Rebecca's name was proposed for one of the top roles, but the missionary quickly explained that women could not hold such a position of authority, as that was unbiblical. Others were taken aback, but said nothing. Rebecca had not felt this way in years, unwanted, second class, and somehow ashamed. She had grown up in a small farming village, only girl amongst 4 brothers. At the age of 14, her brother's friend, Wadi, stopped by the house to see her brother. When he realized that Rebecca was alone, he dragged her into a back room, forced himself upon her, then was gone. It happened several times. Terrified and humiliated, Rebecca had no one she could tell. After a few months, her mother realized that Rebecca was pregnant. If her father or brothers found out, she would be killed. Despite being an innocent victim, in her culture, the blame rests solely on the woman as the temptress and seducer. Rebecca was sent far away to her aunt, where she remained in hiding until the baby was born and immediately taken away. Once her aunt had completed her duty, Rebecca found herself alone, rejected, and forced onto the streets. Though she would eventually be taken in and educated by a Christian mission, where she would hear the gospel and meet her loving Savior, this evening's events still left her with many of the same emotions she had felt as a child. Being a woman had made life difficult in many ways. Now it seemed to be a barrier for using her gifts in the church she loved. Rebecca knew she would only find help in the scriptures. She opened her Bible and prayed.
God, please give me the understanding to know your truth.
Thank you, Leah, for showing that video. It's quite something, isn't it? When you look at this pain and this setting, it's necessary to be able to highlight all of this and to tell our stories. At any rate, so at this stage, what I would like to do, as we are going to discuss all of this in terms of broken leadership and the brokenness of the world, let me introduce you. It's my pleasure and my privilege to introduce you to our two panelists. Jane Overstreet is the president and CEO of Development Associates International, or DAI, a nonprofit organization providing training and consulting in leadership, management, and spiritual formation to more than 100,000 Christian leaders in 82 countries every year. Michele Breene is a DAI consultant. She's also a consultant to Christian organizations, individual leaders, and young people through teaching, facilitating, mentoring, coaching, and spiritual direction. It's a pleasure to have both of them, as they are thoughtful and wise leaders in their field. So this is what people go through. This is an example of brokenness. I just want to mention that this video has been translated in Spanish and it's being used in Latin America. And when its translation is completed in French, it will be used for training in West Africa and Haiti. My question to Jane, when we talk about broken leaders and brokenness, how do you see it impacting our society and our world?
Thank you so much, Marie-Rose. It's a huge question, and it's a really an important question. I've been working in leadership development now for about 26 years. And I think when I began, I was very interested in the academic side of things. DAI has grown now, and as you mentioned, actually last year we were able to help about 244,000 leaders in 79 countries around the world. We have small offices in about 40 of those. And why we have those local offices is what we learned about leadership development is that it's much more than a class, it's much more than a workshop, because bringing change to leaders, how we think and how we process and how we lead is actually much more of a process. I think in the last few years, especially, COVID's probably highlighted this for us, but we've grown to realize how broken almost all of us are because we live in this broken world. Just like Rebecca, it was not her fault what happened to her. And as the more I am involved in spiritual formation and different types of leadership development that involve all of the emotional side of us, and I hear more and more stories, I realize probably the majority of leaders have experienced a lot of pain or a lot of conflict, and most of it is not something they brought on themselves. Most of us are in one way or another victims of that. And sometimes it is our fault, but it doesn't really matter in that sense, because the impact of it is that it makes leadership almost a tool to help make ourselves feel better. Now, what I mean by that is the problem that we uncovered through research years ago was that sort of the big boss controlling power-driven leadership is really the worst problem in our world. And we don't have to look very far to see that in political leaders. But unfortunately, the same disease exists no matter what area of leadership we happen to be working in. Because when there's a deficit inside us somewhere, we find that leadership is a wonderful place to serve, but the power and the identity that comes from it begins to be a whole driving force on its own. So when leaders begin to feel that, I don't think they often intentionally think, I'm going to get all the power I can. But the result is the same, because that power and identity start driving how we lead, and we don't share leadership with others. And we don't recognize the fact that there are a lot of people in our midst that may not have that same power, that have a lot to contribute. So that's kind of the basis of the servant leadership course that we do. It's all about what leadership is really about. It's about enabling others. It's about creating spaces where people can use their gifts. I was just thinking, when we talk about thousands of leaders, it's kind of just amorphous, but I was going to just tell you one quick story that I loved about this. It happened through a master's degree program that we run. And the course was servant leadership, and it was up in Northeast India somewhere in a sort of a tribal zone. And the culture there is, what it accepts is that when families are out in public, the men do not touch the children. That's the women's work. And so even if there's 2 or 3 small children, the man walks in front, goes into the market, and the woman follows behind and is trying to carry one and grab 2 others. But that's just what's acceptable culture, because it's the man and he's the leader. And so anyway, in that area, one of the leaders in that area had taken our course on servant leadership. And he got to thinking about the implications of that and what that meant, and how that really should impact everything in his life. So he woke up one Saturday morning, headed to the market with his family, and he grabbed his, I think, 9-month-old son and put him in his arms. And his wife looked a little startled. She'd been hoping for that for years, I think. He said, you know, if I'm a servant in my community, in my church, in my family, why wouldn't I do this? And so he picked her up and they went off to the market. And when they got to the market, it was, the whole scene was just met with shock and awe. And people were saying, you know, why are you doing this? This isn't our culture. We don't do this kind of thing. What are you doing to us? His men friends were asking him, and he said, why don't we do this? I love this child. I hold this child in our house. Why in the world would I not do it here in public? We should celebrate these children. What are we doing? Well, as you can imagine, this man's a leader. And so the next week, when he went to the market with his child in his arms, what did he find? Most of the other men in the market had their children in their arms. And it's somehow these processes of working this out and seeing something different and then trying it out and realize, you know, servanthood in leadership changes our perspective on so many things. And yet there's these barriers of brokenness that have to be overcome in order to live this out. But when you see a leader change, then you see that potential for a whole community to change, and then it gets very exciting. So I think so many problems in our world are the result of bad leadership. And yeah, we don't have to look very far to see wars and horrors. And I have the deep feeling that so many of those leaders are trying desperately to make up some kind of a deficit inside themselves. And the result, of course, can multiply into horrendous humanitarian crises. But I loved where Emily was starting us with light versus darkness, and just thinking, you know, Jesus is the light of the world. When we have him inside us, that begins a whole process of enabling us to change. But it takes more than that. it takes working at it. It takes looking around and engaging with other people in community who are also trying to grow and change, because we all need healing. We all need help. DAI has been doing a lot of work with trauma healing post-COVID, and that has been really amazing. So many leaders were just almost, I don't know how you would say it, neutralized by the trauma of so much death and so much difficulty. And they just needed help processing. And so oftentimes telling our own stories to each other and then having help thinking through how to find healing in that is just critical in order to be able to change.
Jane, I mean, this is wonderful, but I keep thinking and I keep hearing, because we talk about talking to each other about our difficulties and the burden of leadership, which it is. And people turn to a leader, but very often when you're strong and in a position of leadership, no one supports you. There's also the gender piece, because to the extent where, we're sort of raised with certain stereotypes, and this process that you're talking about, it just feels like it leads to some sort of a certain sense of freedom and liberation, whether we're talking about, women, but also men, and helps gender equality to a certain extent.
Absolutely. One of our key leaders is this wonderful Russian man who loves playing ice hockey and is in many respects an incredibly strong male figure. But from him, I've learned so much about emotional healing. He's also a therapist, and he just says within his culture, for example, almost everyone was raised sort of by the state, and that created a tremendous vacuum and loss of the family. And so it's almost like a culture of orphans. And so you have to create sort of a culture of trust and opportunity for people to really share and open. And they've been realize, whether they're men or women, that they've been through things that God never intended. And they've been hurt by those things, and it's impacted how they see the world, how they do their job. And I think the brokenness between men and women is just one huge element of that, and a very critical one. And so, but understanding even Jesus' model, I think, is so fabulous, because he came into the world not in some amazing power position, but at this season, we know he came as a baby, vulnerable. And then even as he interacted with people, he often did things like healing or speaking a word of knowledge over them and things in that kind of power. But he always refused to accept the kind of power that would bring military strength or overthrow of the government or that kind of thing. But it was instead this deep trust that God cared about him and cares about each of us. And it's somehow in that whole mix of things that leaders, whether they're male or female, need to put their roots and find their strength. And then they have the capacity to serve each other.
I think I think it's wonderful the way you phrase it. And it's also a question of having the strength. Strength is not about only being strong, but also facing your own vulnerability.
Yeah.
Where you find your strength. So, I mean, thank you for sharing all of this. And now, I mean, Michele, as you have done a lot of training and coaching, what I'd love to know is, how can leaders begin to take steps? I know you work with the AI and with a number of organizations. How can leaders begin to take steps towards openness and a more balanced and inclusive form of leadership? And I know we talk about openness, and it just sounds, in terms of nuances. It's not just openness to the rest of the world, but even openness in terms of self-awareness What do we see in ourselves? Or can we accept ourselves, even the broken pieces? Or can we put some gold on the cracks together? Can you tell us more about it?
Well, there's so many directions I could go with this, but welcome everybody, and it's lovely to see you, and thank you for committing this hour to this conversation. It's so important. And thank you, Marie-Rose and Jane. Yeah, what Jane was saying is so critical. It's so fundamental. It's the brokenness which really prevents us from being the servant leaders that God designed us to be. And that brokenness doesn't stop. You know, a servant heart, it's a process, developing a servant heart. And we don't suddenly become servant leaders, you know, and the brokenness comes to an end. It's a process that continues. It's a life journey. And, you know, that can be caused by the hurts in our childhood. It can be caused by guilt we're holding, or shame, fear, anxiety, or some of the gender wounding. As we saw in Rebecca's story, there are all kinds of reasons for it. And often those are kept quiet because of the shame. Actually, Kurt Thompson wrote a book called The Soul of Shame, which is excellent reading if any of you are interested in digging into that a little bit more. But those moments of hurt and trauma are background noise to our life, our growth in life. And every time we make a new relationship or have to do something out of the box, out of our comfort zone, that inner self-talk can act against what we're trying to do and what we'd like to do in our hearts. It's a bit like Paul says in his letters, you know, I do what I don't want to do, and I don't do what I want to do. And so we have, you know, inner thoughts and heart emotions that impact what we do. And even the fact that we say we're going to do something a certain way, and behave a certain way, we can sustain that for days or maybe weeks, but ultimately it's not sustained unless there's a heart change. And so the work I've been trying to do has been more to do with trying to understand people's hearts and to listen to their stories. And I say this because, well, in a past life, like 25 years ago, I think, I worked with an organization in the corporate leadership development world called the Burnham Rosen Group. They're in Boston, actually. And they developed a model that our thoughts lead to our action, which lead to the outcomes. And a lot of behavioral change causes different actions, but it doesn't necessarily cause sustainable outcomes unless the thought patterns have changed. And so they had studied thought patterns for 50 years. And their goal was to find outstanding leaders and what was different about outstanding leaders from mediocre leaders. And they actually, with David McClellan, who founded the social psychology department at Harvard University and was the author of a book called Human Motivation, they created and I don't think AI could touch this actually, but we'll see. They created a system for profiling people's stories. And it comes back to, you know, what's actually going on in our hearts. And they were able to feed back to people we coached what we were seeing in their stories by coding the words they used when they wrote imaginative stories. And I think a lot of this comes out in some of the training I've been working on, both in women and men leadership for DAI and in the gender equity and reconciliation work. And I have seen amazing testimonies to some of the work that's happened because people have an opportunity to be heard and to be seen. And that's so important for addressing the brokenness. And it's so important to have compassionate listening around you, because, you know, we all have that. And the trouble is, if we're led by the brokenness within us, we push our strengths too far. So all the good qualities about us, all our gifts and strengths and passions get overstretched, and then they become counterproductive. And so that's what we see a lot in big boss leadership is there's something that hasn't been addressed. And so there's this fear and there's this anxiety. And so I'm pushing and pushing this inner hustler telling me to do it better, that I'm not worthy. And so the outcome is not servant leadership. It's anything but servant leadership. And the good news is that, you know, we have deeply implanted within us God's DNA of that inner goodness, faith and hope and love. And when we can find that, we really become open to a servant heart, developing a servant heart. And so I think on the Women and Men Leading Together workshop, we do find this over the 3 days. It's good to see you, Ben Victor. I was just thinking the very first pilot that we did of that course was in Cameroon. And you know, some of the testimonies we've heard, I had an email from the wife of one of the participants in a workshop that we held in Kigali. And she said, I just have to write to you because of the change I've seen in my husband. You know, he started helping in the kitchen. When visitors arrive, he makes the tea. You know, he notices when the gas has run out, you know, and he goes to buy it. You know, he consults me before he makes decisions. You know, I always used to think that I had to wait for him to decide on the big things in the house, and now I don't. He's also started to care for my son. You know, it reminds me of Jane's story. He's actually started to cook for him a balanced diet. And so she said before she constantly felt that she was a failing wife because he wouldn't give her any responsibility. And then recently, while she wasn't very well, he swept the compound for them and to just tidy up around the house outside. And her neighbor, who's a deacon in the church, thought that she'd used some kind of witchcraft to control him. She was so amazed. The neighbor was so amazed that this couldn't be a natural act for him. And so, yeah, so stories like that really touch my heart. And I think we still have a long way to go. There's a lot to do. The problem is huge. And in the Burnham Rosen work, we used to focus on addressing our primary social motives, which are for power and control, for social safety and security, and for love and affirmation. And those three social motives have to be satisfied. If we don't find we can cope in life unless those things are accomplished in the work we do or in the relationships we have, then we start to that's when we start to overwork them and we get out of balance and out of sync. And so a combination of those two experiences I had have really helped me to grow as a leader. I've never been a leader of a big organization. I have tremendous admiration for Jane and what Jane's done. But I do love to work with young women, and especially those who show leadership potential, mentoring them, doing spiritual direction and those kinds of things to create some kind of equity. And so the pendulum is not really swinging, as Emily said, the needle's actually gone back a little way. But there are some good things happening, and just being part of that is very consoling. And so the gender equity and reconciliation work, we bring men and women together, and we try to create a safe space for people to share their stories, share the stories of deep hurts, and even taboo subjects that you would never talk about even to your brother or sister. And they come out in this environment because it's spiritual, We take time for silence to ground ourselves. You know, we have agreements about how to keep the space safe, confidentiality and all that kind of thing. And we go back to, you know, what was it like growing up as a girl or as a boy? You know, what did your mother teach you about being a boy or about being a girl? And what did your father teach you about being a boy? And those kinds of things. And we see that the conditioning starts very, very young. And as young boys and girls grow, that's reinforced throughout their lives, right? In peer group conversations. You know, when I started out as a professional, there weren't any women in the industry I chose. It was very male dominated. And, you know, I was often in a room of 40 executives. And it's scary, especially when you have some of your own gender wounding. And so there's an opportunity in this workshop to share some of those things and for men to witness the suffering of women and vice versa. And we really come to recognize the damaging impact of patriarchal norms. And we cry together, we shout and get angry together. And people, you know, have freedom to share the emotions they feel. And then finally to honor one another and to recognize the goodness, the divine femininity and the goodness in men. And so we recognize and appreciate one another in a final celebration on the final day. So it's very impactful and beginnings. I wouldn't say people transform in 3 days, but it's definitely the beginning of transformation, a journey of transformation, which I think the self-awareness that you alluded to, Mary Rose, is just so important. And building self-awareness, you know, we can do that by sharing our stories. We can't address them unless they're out in the open. And Jesus was always doing that. It was like, what do you want me to do for you? Show me, you know, it's like, come forward, tell me what's going on. You know, I'm thinking of the woman who just touched the edge of his gown, you know, and he made a scene of it. He didn't want her to go away quietly, just like she'd entered into the scene. You know, he wanted to make a scene. He wanted her to say what her journey, what her story had been, so that he could speak, you know, to a wider audience about these issues. And so I feel I've had my time, Mary Rose. You can cut me off at any point. I can't hear you.
This is a wonderful conversation. And I have to say that I'm completely enjoying, you know, the words of wisdom and, you know, your insight and Jane's insight in all of that. You know, I'm also trying to manage time and I'd rather not, you know, do it. But there are some questions here that just one very quick comment. In some ways, it's interesting in terms, you talk about the conditioning. My mother joked once and she said that my first word had been why, and I questioned everything, which really made it difficult for me. I was born and raised in Haiti, which is very male dominated. And, you know, in so many ways, I just feel that, you know, as you say, we have to look because religion is so often used and leveraged to reinforce patriarchy. And we are expected as women, at least women are expected to sort of be silent, as the video showed, not do anything and not have any positions of leadership, which, as we know, and we find out more and more about history, or even what's found about the history of the representation of God, that this is not exactly the way it has been. So I just feel like there is so much, even if you look in the Bible, it's not just Jesus, but also sort of like female leadership figures that in so many ways are not brought up. But at any rate, I will stop myself from making a rant. I will go back to this And there are questions here in terms of, there are a couple of people that have asked questions that I feel like we have some time for conversation, and I would like to bring it. One of them is, how do we break free from our own burden of abuse as leaders so we can be present for others and be healed at the same time? I mean, we all know we evolve in circles where we have been hurt someplace, we want to help others, but at the same time, we're still on the path of our own healing. It's still a process. And how do we balance that? So that's one, especially as leaders. The other question that I see is, what are the primary social motives? And I think anybody else, if you have other questions, but we can start with the two. We still have a little bit of time for questions and comments. Jane and Michele, responses?
I was just going to say, with that first question, just the fact that you recognize the brokenness and have the desire for wholeness is enormous. A lot of, especially leaders, are not very self-aware, and so that's like a huge step in the right direction. And there's a lot you can read and a lot you can do on your own. But I think, to be honest, there's something terribly important about community, and finding some help in community, if at all possible, either via Zoom or preferably in person, if that's possible. But reaching out, and you begin looking around and you'll start finding resources for that. I don't know who asked the question where you are. We can always point you to some, maybe locally. But there's just so much to being aware. And so once you are, then the doors are open, you'll find some help.
Yeah, I would agree with everything Jane has said, like the trauma healing that DAI does, the gender equity work, provide safe spaces. I think I would say to whoever asked that question, who have you talked to about this? Who have you shared your story with? Holding that, bottling that up is so painful, and it doesn't go away. No matter how much you think you can, just stop thinking about it. It's always going to, it's the effects of it are always going to trickle into how you develop as a human being and as a leader. And just when you don't expect it, it's gonna suddenly hit you, often. And so I think sharing the story with people who can listen with unconditional love and non-judgment, and in the Jerry process, we don't respond to people when they share their story. We don't go and give them a hug, even. We don't ask questions. We just listen, we nod, we respect, we say, I hear you, and I see you, and I see your suffering. And just to have that, just to be on the recipient end of that is, I can tell you from experience, is amazing. And so, yeah, that's sharing your story, I think, is really important. The other question about social motives, and a lot of psychologists, social psychologists, mystics, and Christian writers talk about these three motives, and Thomas Keating is actually wonderful on this. There's some videos of him talking about it in a Christian context. And we grow up needing safety and security, and it's good that we look to find it, because we need it to keep us safe, right? And we also grow up enjoying love and affirmation and affection. And we also need some degree of power and control in our lives. And sometimes we push too hard for some of those things, and we try to get them our own way. And the Christian journey is really all about you know, how do we let go and let God into that space? So those are the three primary questions. I think Keating talks about them in terms of our emotional programs to find happiness. Yeah.
Sorry.
I was just going to add one more thought. I think there's a tremendous amount of shame that comes with any brokenness that has happened to us. And I think we all have a tendency to, as one of my good friends in West Africa said, you know, I locked that in a box and I threw it away. I didn't want to ever open it again. And so it helps to even realize that more than half the people in the group or in the room have probably experienced something as bad or maybe even worse. And you're not alone. And once sharing starts, then all of a sudden you realize, you know, all of us have had some of these things, and the shame goes out of it because it's not just me. Somehow I thought it was just me, and it was all my fault.
Very true. Yeah.
The question that I also have for you, and I don't know, I mean, I am not seeing, so at this point, I'm just happy to, are there any other questions? Because I've gotten a couple of questions. We've gotten a couple of questions in the chat. Anybody wants to make a comment, a question? I see a lot of kudos. People are appreciating the conversation. We're glad. But I do have a question about the cultural piece. I forgot because about just how much material, I know it's over 80%, but just in terms of psychology or a lot of things that are just done from sort of like a Western perspective. When you're talking about operating throughout the world, and this is where, you know, my mother would always say, why do you have to ask these questions? What writings, what are your observations, what are your practices when it comes to sort of like recognizing that there are different thresholds, there are different traditions, I know that you like to take people where they're at, but in terms of providing something that's tailored to people's cultures as opposed to coming from a very Western perspective.
If I can take the first shot at that, I think from DAI's perspective, one of the things that's been really helpful is that all of our local staff are local in a place, and many of them are really well trained in a variety of different areas of how to help develop leaders, and they've experienced a lot themselves. But when they turn around and operate a group or start something like this, they do it from their cultural perspective. And it makes it very easy for other people from that same perspective to do it, rather than having somebody like me come in from the outside. I can come as a listener, but it always works much better if somebody local actually does offer these kinds of experiences, because they do understand a lot more about what's going on in the room. Having said that, we have done something that Michele's had a lot of input into as well, that and some different nationalities, a program that involves spiritual formation. And we've been doing this in this last year. We've done it in, I guess, 6 different regions of the world. And I've been a little bit shocked at the similarity of impact. It's been facilitated by local people almost in each case, but the working of God in our hearts is something that's much more universal than it is cultural. It has cultural clothing around it, but human beings deal with the same issues. So that interplay is fascinating for me, and of course it's where I spend a lot of my life.
Thank you. Reverend Arlene, would you like to, you have a question, would you like to say it? To join the conversation, or do you want me to just say it?
Sure, thank you, Mary Rose. Good morning, everyone. Michele and Jane, I so appreciate your presentation. So much of that hits home. The question I had was on the book that Michele referenced about the soul of shame. I think I was trying to capture my notes when my phone rang.
Yeah,
So,
I'll put it in the chat for you all.
And then I have a follow-up from that for us women who are endeavoring to deal with our own gender wounding while leading and raising up young women who will also become servant leadership. What's your encouragement to us?
Michele, I have a feeling we both have thoughts. First?
Sure. Well, I would say when women, young women come to a workshop or to work with me in a mentoring relationship, they have a lot of stories to tell, and my encouragement is always to recognize the goodness, their goodness deep within, and to build on that, and to really share their story. And I think everybody's journey is different, right? And so I think for young women who are often marginalized, like Rebecca, Rebecca's story is so, in some ways, it's so common to people all over the world, wherever you are. I think it's important for women to recognize and be empowered for the goodness that they have, and have conversations with older women about their calling, their passions, their gifts, recognizing them, learning how to identify them, and then to share their voice around those things that they feel they're gifted in, passions that they have, and have opportunities to do that at school, with groups of friends. I think we can start quite young, younger than the age that I tend to see young women. But yeah, Jane, I'm sure you have a lot to add to that.
We like teaching together, by the way. I'm surprised at the number of times I've had women walk up to me after some event or something where I was speaking or in front or something, and say to me, the most important thing is that you're actually here and that you're doing this. And we haven't seen a woman in leadership. And so at that point, I panic slightly, because I think, oh dear, I'm a model. This is scary, So I think besides modeling, I think keeping my own heart and humility level really clear, that my strength comes from how God created me and who He is to me today. And without that, I don't have a whole lot to offer. And so that perspective, so that what I do model isn't about power and position. So it's somehow a nice balance between being willing to model leadership as a woman, but model it in a sense of humility and admitting brokenness, and yet at the same time strength. So it's trying to find that balance. I mean, I can only find it when I'm really in good touch with God.
I think also we can, when we're raising girls, I think we can fall into the trap sometimes of encouraging them by saying, oh, you look so pretty, or I love that dress on you, or focusing on their physical appearance. And they start to build up, okay, this is important, and they start to build up messages that are not necessarily the messages you want them to know about themselves. You want them, so catching something that's important for their life and encouraging that, noticing it, I think is also helpful.
Yeah, very practical.
Yeah.
I think we are getting to the end, even though I hate to see it. One of the things that I would say is that, and I want to highlight, is the need for community, the need for support. What I also hear is the need for self-awareness, to cultivate that, and the idea of supporting yourself. Because in so many ways, we live in societies that are not supportive, especially when it comes to leaders and especially when it comes to women in positions of leadership. It's actually fairly demanding and negative when it comes to women in position of leadership. But what I also heard through all of that is that there are, which is a message of hope, there are pathways. If we're interested in embracing them, embracing a different way, there are ways we can find healing, we can find balance and everything else. I want to thank each and every one of you. I mean, first the panelists, Jane and Michele, thank you so much for all of the time that you've invested in this, in the planning of this, and the your words of wisdom. And I would encourage everyone to sort of like look up what they do and some of the books that they've suggested. I want to thank everyone who's been a part of it. We will be having more courageous conversations, and hopefully this is a safe space where we can discuss issues that matter and that should be discussed. One of the things that I just want to say very quickly is we have a hub and there are opportunities for dialogue. There are different people coming from all over the world. Please come and join our community. Community and connections are critical to making sure that we continue to be strong, to be healthy, and we continue on the pathway to healing and being whole. We also have a reading journey that is coming up. Please check it out. It's will be on January 11. And now that I've
actually it begins now whenever you start reading, right? Yes.
And I want to pass the baton and make sure that there is a last word. Emily, Michele, Jane, because as I said, I'm thankful and I want to thank everyone. And please, the last word of anything.
Well, let me just say thank you, Jane and Michele. I could listen to you all day. And I just so admire the work that DAI does, and then Jerry, to really mainstream gender equality while honoring whatever faith tradition, DAI Christian tradition, like working within that and mainstreaming it, not starting with, it can be scary to go on this journey. And as you both have said, it's a deep dive and it doesn't get solved in 3 days. So you have to go on a journey, and DAI works around the world and in places where, a lot of the men and women you serve are doing really important work, in NGOs, nonprofits, and in the church to, just address a lot of humanitarian problems. But then within our own religious traditions, often we're undermining that gender balance and wholeness that we're seeking to achieve. So it's just very sensitive work, and I really appreciate it. And the video was an honor to create with both of you. I just want to give Jane the credit for writing the story. It's beautiful, and we didn't get to spotlight all of it. There's other chapters of her life where she shares her experience watching women and girls in a humanitarian setting, and she connects it with what's happening in church. And Michele saw this and said this would be a great Girl Child Long Walk video, so together we created a video. It was a real joy to do that. And so whatever your next step is on your own journey, we invite you to check out DAI, to check out Jerry, and to join us in the Girl Child Long Walk project as Marie Rose said, we have an app, and I wish we had time to get everyone to download it right now while we're on the call. It's really not that hard. And on the app, you have, you'll get all the invites to the Courageous Conversations. You can chat about what you experienced. And then the reading journey, which is really the core of the project, all the materials are there, so you can start reading along. And that's really a safe and brave space to do this work. There's so many layers to the patriarchal conditioning. And if you don't understand how it arose and the nature of the problem, very much like with race, if you don't understand the roots of slavery, then you can't be part of the solution. So that will be a space where you can get into more dialogue with each other. So we invite you to take that journey with us. I think that's my last infomercial. Is there anything else, Marie Rose, that are talking points that we were supposed to say? Or Leah?
But Jane and Michele, one last chance to say something besides, I think I have thanked everyone, and especially sort of like the two of you, but everyone to be here. But if there's anything that you want to share last, otherwise, we're happy to close for now, as we're all on our own journey.
I just want to say thanks for the opportunity, and every half step on this journey is worth it. Mm-hmm. So I just want to encourage you that there's just tons of hope. There's a lot of help possible, and growing and changing is the most marvelous thing in the world, because then you can actually help the people around you instead of hurting them. So thank you all.
I would just say, yes, I agree, holding on to hope. And actually, I was struck by something I read by Ivan Illich the other day. I just want to read it to you quickly before we close. Neither revolution nor reformation can ultimately change a society. Rather, you must tell a new and powerful tale, one so persuasive that it sweeps away all the old myths and becomes the preferred story, one so inclusive that it gathers all the bits of our past and our present into a coherent whole, one that even shines some light into the future so that we can take the next step. If you want to change a society, then you have to tell an alternative story. And so I just encourage you all to go tell alternative stories about the ways that women and men can lead together in equitable relationships, and how much the world will gain from that.
Well, what a beautiful word to end with. May it be so. Amen.